Now, please join me in welcoming the winner of the Chicago Tribune Literary Prize, Salman Rushdie.
You can draw a crowd.
Look at you. I was just saying, I spent 10 years running the Penn World Voices Festival in New York, and we would never get anybody at 10 o'clock in the morning.
So, it's 11 in New York, if it makes any difference. Yeah, congratulations on the Tribune Award.
Thank you.
Congratulations on 2 years, 8 months, and 28 nights. It's a fantastic read.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed it. And I guess anytime you can get Captain Beefheart and Bob Dylan and Lou Reed and flying figures that have creating havoc and have lots and lots of sex, nothing can go wrong.
It's a good start. It's a good start. Yeah. I mean, I'm very pleased, actually, at the way this book's gone down, because somehow, at the age of 68, people have noticed that I'm a funny writer. Finally.
Would you talk some? I'm a journalist. I'm a day-to-day writer. Done in a day, and you're out. I look at a project like this or some of the other works that you've done, and frankly, they're daunting. How do you say with this work? What was the conception? Did you start with a compelling character, a story, a theme? Was there a point you wanted to make and build a story around it?
Characteristically, what happens with me is I get like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, and I don't know how they fit together, or sometimes I don't even know if they belong in the same puzzle. And then gradually I find missing bits that fit them together. I mean, in this case, I did have one or two of the characters. I mean, I had the character of Mr. Geronimo, the levitating gardener. And he was there at the beginning, and there was a bit when I thought the novel might just be about him. It might just be about somebody to whom, in a kind of Kafkaesque way, somebody to whom a kind of unexplained metamorphic event happens that is never explained and that he has to deal with, and people around him have to deal with, like Kafka's Gregor Samsa turning into a slightly, there's a controversy about exactly what insect he turns into. Mm-hmm. It's clearly not a cockroach. It's sometimes translated as dung beetle, but it's not specified. Anyway, something like that, I thought. And then I had the idea of my fairy princess falling in love with my 12th century philosopher. And I didn't, they just gradually grew into they grew towards each other, into the same book. What I did have, I think, was after the book I wrote before this was the memoir, the autobiographical memoir, Joseph Anton. And I think after I'd spent, whatever it was, 3 years writing that book and trying very hard to be scrupulous and tell the truth and so on, I had a kind of emotional reaction against that kind of writing, and I really wanted to do something much more fictionally fictional, very, very kind of fabulous, and sort of go to the other end of the literary spectrum.
In some ways, it feels like a 1,000-piece puzzle in a 100-piece box. There's so many stories here, and then they go away. I guess like the gins. It could have been an epic as much as a 250-word
But what
novel.
I wanted to suggest, here's the thing: it is a deliberately overcrowded narrative. And the reason for that is I thought it's something to do with what I think about how one represents metropolitan life. I think one of the things about a life in a great city is that we are, all of us, surrounded by other people's stories. There's a crowd of stories that our story makes its way in between. And sometimes we engage with somebody in the crowd, and sometimes not. We just pass by and so on. So I thought a way of representing the city, if you like, in a book is to have that kind of overcrowded narrative, that sense that your story is pushing its way through a crowd of stories. And sometimes those stories are developed and you find out what happens, and sometimes you just pass by them, and you think, what was that? But we're not telling that story, we're telling this one, And So, yeah, I mean, it's, all I can say is it's on purpose.
So that sense of chaos was on purpose. I think you said this book was an attempt to convey a world where things are happening fast. We're losing control of them, and we don't quite.
Yeah, I just think we live in it. In the book, it's called the time of the strangenesses, but I think we actually live in that time. You know, we live in a time where the world has become very alienating and strange, where not only is it changing very dramatically, but it's also changing at incredible speed. You know, and the combination of that, the radical nature of the change and the accelerated nature of the change, makes it very alarming and bewildering, I think, sometimes.
Starts with a 12th century philosopher whose name sounds suspiciously like yours.
Yeah, yes. Well, Ibn Rushd, who's a real person, Averroes in the westernized version of his name, a great Aristotelian philosopher in 12th century Spain, who my father admired so much that he changed our family name to Rushdie. My grandfather was not called Rushdie. You know, my father decided, in the honor of this philosopher, to change the name. I mean, I only found out about this. I mean, I didn't know when I was a kid, but I found out when I was growing up, and then I became very interested in him. And when I was at college, I guess, I read some of his work and understood why my father was so drawn to him, because he's a very attractive philosopher. I mean, he's a, you know, in 12th century Islamic Spain, during the Arab period of rule in Spain, he represented the progressive voice. You know, because he was a great admirer of Aristotle, he wanted to bring the principles of Aristotelian logic and rationality and tolerance and openness and, you know, science and so on into the world of Islamic philosophy. And he was attacked by the fanatics of his time, you know, as well. And so much later, and this was, I mean, I read him when I was 20 years old or so. One of the things that I really loved was the title of his books. His great adversary in thought was also a bit in the novel, was the conservative philosopher Ghazali. And Ghazali had written this book called The Incoherence of the Philosophers, which was basically an attack on philosophy as something that couldn't begin to understand the mind of God. So, Ibn Rushd wrote a response to it with the wonderful title, The Incoherence of the Incoherence. And I thought, that guy is... there were 5 minutes when I thought I might call this book The Incoherence of the Incoherence. And then I thought that, you know, that's like handing your critics the baseball bat, you know.
Well, in a way, there's so much focus on magic in this book. Are people missing the realism?
Well, I think that's the problem with that phrase, magic realism, is that when people use it, they really only hear the word magic. And they don't understand that the only reason this kind of writing works is that when it works because it has very deep roots in observation and reality. You know? So, I mean, I think one of the reasons why these wonderful old stories, the so-called wonder tales, have survived is because while they're full of, you know, ogres and flying carpets and genies and so on, the human beings in them are completely real. You know, and they think and behave and act and react as human beings do, you know, and they're of all different kinds. They're heroic and cowardly and greedy and sweet and unpleasant and so on. And really, in a way, what those stories ask, the question they ask, is I think the same thing that this book asks, is that how do ordinary people react to the arrival in their lives of the extraordinary? You know, I mean, what happens to us when the unexpected, the unpredictable, the unfathomable suddenly enters our lives? How do we deal with that? And, you know, some people deal with it not so well, and some people find in themselves resources of character, strengths that they didn't know they had, you know, and are able to rise to the occasion, you know, and become able to deal with whatever life throws at them, you know. And I think that's the great truth of the wonder tale, you know, and that's really, I think, what this book is also reaching for, because, you know, there are these children, these contemporary characters in the book who are descendants of the love affair long ago between the genie princess and the 12th century philosopher. So the conceit is that they have little bits of jinn blood, in them. But that's really just a way of saying that they find in themselves the strength with which to resist the horrifying attack that comes at them.
Reading some reviews of this and other books in recent years, and you get very good reviews from many quarters, but I had a feeling that you can be a victim of your own success when you were such a blockbuster at a relatively young age and have been so successful for several decades now. It kind of reminded me of what people say about Bob Dylan. He puts out an album and people listen to it and say, well, that's some pretty good stuff here, but it's no Highway 61 revisited.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to be put in the same sentence as Bob Dylan, so thank you. I'll take that. No, I mean, that happens a little bit. I mean, I've always remembered that I was friendly for a while with the great American writer Joseph Heller, and he used to get this. People would say to him, "Yeah, it's your book's good, but it's not as good as Catch-22." And journalists, he said, when journalists say to him that you haven't really ever written anything as good as Catch-22, have you? He would say, "Yeah, but neither has anyone else." So I think that's a good answer. But I remember when I met, as a young writer, I met the great German novelist and later Nobel laureate Günter Grass. That again, there was a tendency for people to say that nothing he'd written was as good as The Tin Drum, which is the book with which he burst on the scene. And it's just what happens. And I mean, I'm just happy that on the whole, I get a pretty reasonable ride. And this book in particular, really has had a wonderful reception on the whole, except to the Chicago Tribune.
Joseph Anton, the memoir was brilliant, and you just don't read many memoirs start off in a field at the birth, and this one starts like a James Bond novel with the shocking news, the chase, hiding, safe houses, the whole thing. But before we get to all that, I want to ask you about it. There was something that you said in there that you talk about early on, writing almost unbearable amounts of garbage. Your first book was largely ignored.
Yeah.
Your second book is prepared, and the first read says, maybe you should concentrate on short stories before you get this novel thing down. It's Midnight's Children.
Yes.
How close were you to flaming out and going back and being an advertising copywriter?
Oh, Midnight's Children was a kind of, Hollywood or bust moment. I mean, I really thought, if people don't like that book, then maybe I don't know how to write a good book. And unfortunately, people did like it. But yes, it did have this. I only found out afterwards. I mean, I found after the book won the Booker Prize and so on. A newspaper in England got hold of this story that it had had a bad first reader's report. And I had no idea. I thought it was a made-up story. And so I called my editor and I said, there's this nonsense in the newspaper about bad reader's report. And she said, not completely nonsense. And then told me, which she had never told me, that they had received this very brief, very dismissive report, which said, the author should concentrate on short stories till he has mastered the novel form. And then fortunately they had a second reader's report that was much more positive. And then my editor, Liz Calder, at Jonathan Cape in England, went to the head of the company, Tom Mashler, a great publisher, came into her office and said, what are you looking at? And she said, well, there's this book and I think it's really good. And one reader liked it and one reader didn't. And so Tom said, well, give me a chunk of it. And so Liz gave him like the first 150 pages of the manuscript or something, and he took them away overnight. And he came back in the next morning and he put them down on her desk and he said, if you haven't bought that in 1 hour, you're fired. And so I lucked out.
What lifts you from writing unbearable amounts of garbage to writing Midnight's Children? Was there something that you learned?
Well, yeah, practice. I mean, I think some writers are fortunate in that they find their books, right away. And and they go off like a rocket, you know. And I think in my generation in Britain, there were a lot of writers like that. You know, there's writers like Ian McEwan and Martin Amis and Julian Barnes and Kazuo Ishiguro and etc., who were all very, very, I mean, they seemed to know what they were doing right out of the egg, you know. And it just took me longer, you know. And sometimes it doesn't happen immediately. Sometimes you have to work out who you are and what kind of books are yours to write, and it takes you a while to discover that. But it just took me a long while.
Joseph Anton is just chilling. I mean, the stories about this is in the aftermath and the days that the fatwa is issued, and you talk about the moment when police told you that the apartment door was wide open and you didn't know where your young child was for, I guess, for several hours.
Yeah, they made a mistake. They looked at the wrong house. Gee, thanks a lot, you know. Yeah, I mean, there were very scary moments. And then there were moments which, if they hadn't been not funny, they would have been funny. And I mean, one of those moments was the first time I came to America after the fatwa. I'd been invited to speak at Columbia at some free speech event, First Amendment event. And the NYPD, bless their hearts, got very excited. And so they met me off the plane in an 11-vehicle motorcade. And the middle vehicle was a white armored stretch. And I thought, you know, it's like having a neon sign in the sky, going, here. Like a big Monty Python hand, you know. And there was this police officer who, I just slightly changed his name in the book, but just to spare his blushes. Anyway, Lieutenant Bob, who was for the day known as Hudson Commander. And I said, Lieutenant Bob, this is a lot. You know, I said, wouldn't it be better to put me in like a used Buick and drive me through the back streets of Queens, you know? I said, no, sir, that would not be better. And so then I said, who else would you do this for? And I said, so, well, this is what we do for Arafat. Suddenly understood that I was being treated like the leader of the PLO. that was one. And I said, well, suppose if it was the president, what would you do more than this? Because this seems like everything. And I said, no, sir, if you were the president of these United States, we'd close down a lot of these streets here, sir. And we'd have motorcycles, and we'd have men on the rooftops there, but we didn't want to do that in your case because we reckoned it would look too conspicuous. This, you know, I mean, he wasn't kidding. And even that, you know, my then girlfriend, afterwards my wife, had arrived to meet me at the hotel where we were put in this suite with bulletproof mattresses over the windows, you know. And she arrived, and Lieutenant Bob was very, very alarmed by her. And I was saying, Lieutenant Bob, she's cool, you know. You know, Elizabeth's cool. She's with me. Don't worry about her. And he said, if I wanted to kill you, sir, she's exactly who I'd send. So, you know, you see what I mean? It's sort of simultaneously funny and not funny.
So what was the point where you felt reasonably safe again?
Well, I mean, there wasn't like a light switch moment, you know, it just got gradually. I mean, obviously the moment which did make a big difference was essentially the deal that was done at the United Nations between British and the Iranians with American help, which was in like 98 or something like that. Mm-hmm. And even after that, I mean, I have to say, one of the groups of people that I became really impressed by were the British security forces. I thought, you know, these people are really good at their job, and super tough, and I'm glad they're on my side. And even after the deal was done, I've sometimes been into that James Bond building, on the river, with and have met. I can tell you that the head of the British Secret Service is not called M. However, she is called C, which I guess stands for control or something. But anyway, C. I've met more than one. I've met two Cs, and they said to me after the deal with the Iranians, they said, "Look, this is the Iranian government. We're going to just believe them." They said, "We haven't looked after you for 9 years in order to just believe them now." So they said, "If you'll excuse us, we're just going to make sure." And they took about a year to make sure. And after about a year, they said, "Okay, we have reason to believe that they're doing what they said they'd do." They called the dogs off. And one of the great things about them, because they used completely a need-to-know principle, they wouldn't ever tell you why they knew things or how they knew things, because you didn't need to know that, because of source protection and things like that. And so I said to them, I said, "Well, if you now think that the threat is actually over, you need to tell me why you think that, since the threat is against, as it were, me." And this very, very pleasant but very tough young man sitting across the table from me leans forward to me like this, and he says, "No." And I said, "Oh, you mean no?" And he said, "Yes. I mean no." I said, "Oh, okay. I can take that. I can understand that." But so don't ask me why they knew what they knew, but that was what they knew. And as I say, I became very impressed with them. I met a lot of security forces in those days. I should write a spy novel, really. There was a moment when, John le Carré was sort of rude to me at one point. And I was rude to him too. And the newspapers had fun with that for a while. And I sort of regret it because, I don't like fighting with other writers. But anyway, in the middle of that fight with John le Carré, I actually had to have one of those meetings in the building on the river. And the C of the time was furious with le Carré. She said, "Doesn't this man know what's going on here? And don't he know what this is about?" And I said, "Well, ma'am, I don't know." I said, "I thought he was one of you. I thought he'd worked here." And she said, "Well, I suppose he did work here for about 5 minutes."
Well, he blamed you, right? He said you were insensitive to one of the world's great.
And all that. Anyway, the point is, we had a fight, and then Hitchens joined in, got much ruder, and then years later, he did kind of say he was sorry. He made a very le Carré-esque apology, where he said in some interview that he said, "Maybe I was wrong," he said, "but if I was wrong for the right reasons."
We met a few months after the Charlie Hebdo attack. We met at the Tribune with Zineb El-Razwi, one of the writers for Charlie Hebdo, and she was in Morocco, so she wasn't there at the time of the assault, but was a survivor and now had threats against her and was still sort of getting used to that. Suddenly, as she said, "You want to go out for milk, somebody has to speak into a little buzzer and escort you out just down to the corner." Have you talked to any of the survivors?
Yes, two of them actually came to the Penn World Voices Festival earlier this year in the spring. Gerard Biard, who is now the editor, and Jean-Baptiste Touré, who was the film critic who escaped assassination only because, like a good French critic, film critic, he was late for work. Mm-hmm. So he got to work like an hour late and everybody was dead. So he's a survivor too. And the thing about them is that they're extremely reasonable people. There was this sort of argument in Penn about whether we should be honoring them or not, which is an absurd argument. But we tried to arrange a conversation between the two of them and some of the writers who had disagreed with the fact that we were going to honor them. And Jean-Baptiste said, he said, you know, they should come and talk. Let's talk about it. He said, because if they didn't like some of the cartoons, maybe I'll agree with them. Because maybe I didn't like some of the cartoons. Because he said, we used to, Charlie Hebdo, we fight all the time. You know, everybody argues about what should go in, what shouldn't go in, what is good, what is bad. And everybody at the magazine dislikes half the magazine. You know, and because that's how it is. You know, and so he said, but that's not the point. The point is that our friends were executed. That's the point. You know, and I'm sorry to say that the people who had protested against the award chickened out of coming to the discussion. That, you know, like 1 hour before the appointed time, they sent a joint email saying, you know, that they wouldn't come for I thought a rather limp reason. They said we see these gentlemen as being recently bereaved, and we don't want to add to their pain. And Jean-Baptiste, who's very sweet and tolerant, etc., but at that point he said, "Ça c'est bullshit."
That controversy was similar, I guess, to what Le Carré was accusing you of, that should a cartoonist essentially self-censor?
Yeah,
is there a point where you are being rude?
The answer is no. The answer is no. What would a respectful political cartoon look like? You know?
A boring one.
I mean, it can't be such. I mean, the nature of the form is disrespect. You know, and so if you're going to have political cartoons, that's what they like.
Have you, in the wake of this, in any way, you think self-censored?
No.
Tailored what you would write? I mean, who would want to go through that again?
No, I think, you see, here's my view. If you're not a good writer, that's not your fault. You know, that's just your problem. But if you're a self-censoring writer, that is your fault. Because then you're choosing to be a bad writer, you know, and that's, to my mind, not forgivable. You can forgive, you know, Dan Brown, because because he can't do any better.
It's something I've always wanted to ask. I heard you speak many years ago to American Society of Newspaper Editors. You were talking about the press coverage of what was happening to you. You said to the editors that every journalist should have journalism done to him.
Yeah.
I quoted that a lot. Yeah. Is it really that bad to have journalism done to you?
No, I mean, look, I mean, I'm a great admirer of journalism, but it is true that very often when you have been a part of an event that is reported on, and then you look at the reportage of that event, you don't recognize the event in the reportage. You know, that's quite common. You know, and I suppose that's just because of the point of view from which people are looking. You know, but it is always a little bewildering to be in a room where things have happened and which you remember clearly in a certain way, and then you read about what happened in the room, and you think, where was this person? Because they don't appear to have been in the same room I was in. You know, and that does happen. I mean, but you know, it doesn't happen all the time. And in the memoir, I made up this newspaper called The Daily Insult.
That wasn't real?
No, it actually is real, but it's just not called that. And that, I mean, I'm talking about that kind of journalism, really. I'm talking about that kind of attack dog journalism, you know. And there is also a sense in which, if we just talk about profile journalism, profile feature journalism, there's a belief that if you just have a nice conversation with somebody and you report that, then you somehow haven't got to who the person actually is. You know, as if the person is secretly deceiving the journalist into not noticing that he's actually an asshole. And if you can just dig through all the nice stuff, you'll find the asshole beneath. You know? And then you've done your job. And, you know, I mean, I beg to differ.
Do you get a sense, what happened to you and the Iranian hostage crisis a decade earlier both seemed to anticipate what has happened in more recent years, as grand and awful as 9/11 and the rise of ISIS, and as terrible and small, perhaps, as a Washington Post reporter being held by Iran, essentially as hostage. In this time, has religious fundamental, you know, could you argue that Charlie Hebdo essentially was a success because of self-censorship? Few publications ran it. There was fear. You've talked about sort of an atmosphere of fear.
There's a real fear, yeah. And, well, I think in Europe it's slightly different than here because one of the things about that magazine is that even though it had very small circulation and it was on the edge of going out of business, I mean, now suddenly it's actually got rather more money because, you know, because of the success of the issues after the murders. But it was really, you know, 20,000 people read it and it was broke. And yet, these people were very beloved in France, you know, so they were not just those cartoonists who did rude things and got killed. They were, you know, big figures in French culture, and they were incredibly loved. And so in Europe, the reaction to this was that, you know, somebody killed people we love. And here, because it's more distant, you know, it doesn't have that sense of emotional closeness. But yeah, it's a frightening time, you know. And I do think that, in a way, what happened to me, what it now is 27, 28 years ago, was in some way, you know, the first note of the music, you know. And now, I mean, what happened to me is now happening to all of us.
Mm-hmm. Should the world, you look at a Washington Post reporter being held, should the world be engaging with Iran or trying to freeze out Iran as long as this kind of behavior happens by a state?
I don't know. Fortunately, I'm not a politician and don't have to make that decision. I mean, I feel very, you know, conflicted about that because I have no great love for the Iranian regime for strange reasons, you know, very personal reasons. But on the other hand, I also feel that, you know, since 9/11, we've essentially been at war, and that hasn't helped. You know, the world is not a safer place now than it was on September the 10th, 2001. In fact, in many ways, it's a more dangerous place. And so, you know, the path of war has not been a great success. So if there's an option of trying peace, but, you know, I mean, I'm in favor of peace. I mean, I think the whole thing with the Iran deal is entirely about transparency. You know, if the Iranians keep their side of the deal, which is to allow, you know, inspections and surveys and, you know, to allow the West to satisfy itself that they're doing what they say they're going to do, then, you know, then it's sort of a good deal. But if they don't do that, then not such a good deal. And we'll see.
Flip side of that, I guess, you've written and talked often about issues on college campuses, academia, cases of essentially censorship, microaggressions, the idea that you cannot speak in ways that might offend me. How dangerous, how pervasive is it?
It's nonsense. It's nonsense, and it needs to be called out as nonsense and rejected as firmly as possible. You know, I mean, there was this episode a couple of months ago where these students at Duke refused to read Alison Bechdel's book because it was written by a lesbian and that offended their religious beliefs. I thought, you know, maybe you should just not be at Duke. Maybe you could just step down and make room for people who actually want to learn something, you know, which is what a university is supposed to be about.
But in many cases, it's the university establishment itself.
Because
right?
there's a fear. There's again, you know, there's this kind of terrible fear of being politically incorrect. And I mean, I think actually universities so far have not been caving in too badly, but I think they certainly, people feel the pressure, you know, of this new form of censorship. Censorship for what appear to be virtuous reasons. But it just seems to me that the university is the place where young people should be challenged every day, you know, where everything they know should be put into question so that they can think and learn and grow up. That's what they're there to do. And the idea that they should be protected from ideas that they might not like is the opposite of what a university should be. In a university, it's ideas that should be protected. You know, it's the discussion of ideas that should be given a safe place. The university should be a safe space for the life of the mind. That's what it's for. You know, I mean, I do a bit. You know, I mean, I taught at Emory for 10 years, and I'm now on the faculty at NYU, and all I can say is never crossed my door. I mean, nobody's ever, I've never had a student saying it to me. And if they did, they would not enjoy what followed.
You're on the campus of a university system that's had a couple of these issues. Stephen Salida was offered a position in the University of Illinois system. The university looked at tweets that he had put out that were deemed anti-Semitic, harsh, and now he had not been formally offered the job, but it was withdrawn.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the case, so I can't comment, but I mean, I'm not in favor of anti-Semitism, you know, but I think on the whole, you need to allow ideas to be expressed so that you can knock them down. You know, bad ideas don't cease to exist because you forbid them. You know, in many ways, they increase in power by being glamorized by being called taboo. You know, I mean, there are countries in Europe which have been having this argument because there are countries in Europe where Holocaust denial is a crime. You know, and you understand why, because those are the countries in which the Holocaust happened, you know, or was perpetrated against other people, Germany, Austria, Poland, you know. So you can see why the laws are there. But I think at this point anyway, it's a real mistake, because there was this case a couple of years ago where the Holocaust denying, quotes, historian, unquotes, David Irving, spoke in Austria and was sent to jail. And I thought it made him a martyr, whereas actually otherwise he was just a loser. and it's much better to be in that place. So I mean, I think one of the great glories of this country is the First Amendment. You know, and the point about that, you know, I mean, the First Amendment, you know, even the Western democracies differ about the limits of free expression. You know, so, for instance, England has a thing called the Race Relations Act, which makes it a crime punishable by jail to make racist statements. You know, and when I lived in England all that time, I thought, well, nothing wrong with that. You know, what's wrong with that? When you come to America and you realize that the First Amendment actually even protects a lot of that, so which is why the things like the KKK can exist and say what they have to say. I mean, I really wasn't sure what I thought about that for a long time, and I came round to moving from, if you like, the British view to the First Amendment view, which is it's better, you know, who sets the limit? If you're going to start limiting free speech, who sets that limit? And once you've accepted the principle of limiting it, those goalposts can get moved all the time. And then the next thing you know, something you'll want to have said is going to get forbidden.
We're going to run short on time, and I want to make sure we get to some of the audience questions if we can. Since young people don't appear to read or write with long, specific words and phrases, what do you think literary fiction will be like in 50 years? Nothing like starting with a
I would like to speak in defense of the reading habits of young people. Because I think it's not as bad as all that, you know. And I mean, I've spent a lot of time now going around talking in the American Academy, you know, all over the place for 15 or 16 years now, and I'm really being encouraged by the really quite large numbers of young people who appear to be passionate about books. It's very interesting to see how much there is on the internet in the way of blogs and book websites where people are arguing and talking about discussing books they read and etc. The book is a very resilient thing. You know, everything in the last couple of hundred years, every new technology has been supposed to destroy books. You know, radio, television, cinema, you know, the internet, everything's supposed to destroy books, and yet, oddly, there they still are, and book sales are kind of doing that at the moment.
So who are the contemporary writers that interest you most?
Oh gosh, well, a lot. Actually, well, I'll just say one of the things I really am interested in, especially I was going to say, given that one of the other people who's going to be here today is Chang-Rae Lee, is that there's this new generation in American literature of immigrants from everywhere. You know, I mean, American literature has always been fueled by migrants, you know, whether it's Eastern European Jewish migrants or Italian migrants or whatever. But now, there are really writers from everywhere in the world coming to America and writing their books and making the experience of everywhere into part of American literature. You know, so you have Chang-Rae Lee, you have Jhumpa Lahiri, you have Junot Diaz, you have, you know, the Vietnamese novelist Nam Le, you have the Chinese-American writer Yi Yun Lee. There's literally writers from everywhere telling stories which have become American stories. And I think it's been incredibly enriching of American literature that this young generation is there. And it kind of inspired me because it felt as if, you know, here are these people arriving in America with their suitcases, you know, and in their suitcases are all these stories from everywhere else, which they unpack, and then those stories become also American stories, you know. And I thought, well, I've got those suitcases too, you know. I mean, I've got stories from somewhere else, so how about I unpack my luggage, you know, and throw some of those stories at America. I mean, somebody asked me, you know, what happens particularly in Los Angeles is that you're asked for, you know, like the high concept description of your novel. High concept, if you don't know it, is 10 words or less. This is the attention span of the average film mogul. So in 10 words or less, genies attack Manhattan.
All right, we did talk about many of these questions, but here's one we didn't. Say something nice about Christopher Hitchens.
Oh, let me just, since it's the funniest way of talking about Christopher, he was one of the funniest people that I ever met in my life. And in many ways, the comedy that, you know, we used to have these evenings where you'd end up aching with laughter. And not having those is a real sadness. And we invented terrible games, word games. Martin Amis and he invented the dirty ones, and I and he invented the clean ones. So the dirty ones include taking the titles of books or films or songs or whatever, and removing the word love and substituting it for it the phrase hysterical sex. So you have, you know, hysterical sex in the time of cholera. You know? And hysterical sex is a many splendid thing. All you need is hysterical sex, etc. So that was one game. That was Martin and Christopher's game. And my game with Christopher was titles that don't quite make it, like, you know, A Farewell to Weapons. You know? You know, For Whom the Bell Rings. Yeah, Mr. Zhivago. Toby Dick. Of which the alternative title is Moby Prick. You know, Blueberry Finn. Etc., etc. You could play this. It's like I'm sorry I've done this because this is like a computer virus. You know, well, you will not be able to stop playing this game.
All right,
yeah, The Big Gatsby. Yeah, 2 days in the life of Ivan Denisovich. Etc. You see what I mean?
All right, last question because we are out of time, but inquiring minds want to know, do you still hang out with you two?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I do. We're friends. You know, I just went to the show In New York, they were at Madison Square Garden lately. And I mean, you know, it was a great show, but I mean, Bono's still quite beaten up from his accident.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, he's performing and all that, but it's going to be a year, he said, before he knows if he can play the guitar again. And as he puts it, because he's Irish and funny, he said the other members of the band don't seem to mind too much. But yeah, I mean, they're fun. And one of my great, you know, prides of my CV is that I wrote the lyrics for a U2 song. And just called The Ground Beneath Her Feet. Find it on YouTube. There's a video that I'm in with me and them and Mila Jovovich, directed by Wim Wenders. So that's my one music video appearance. Actually, no, it's not. They have another one. I'm in a music video with Scarlett Johansson.
You bury the leads.
Yeah, I know. Kissing the back of her neck. Which what? It's a whole other story.
It's going to have to be for another time. Salman Rushdie, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Really enjoyed it.